British sailors can't stop staring at the Japanese freighter sliding toward them. It's 1940. Japan still hasn't declared war, so this ship has no business charging in like it's looking for a fight. Then, in the blink of an eye, steel shutters snap open and panels drop away, revealing a set of hidden guns that swing out like fans. A German war flag claws its way up the mast. This isn't a normal Kriegsmarine ship, but a member of Hitler's elite naval murder squad. These are Nazi pirates. Hitler was certain. His Kriegsmarine would soon grow so big and strong that not even the Royal Navy could stop it from claiming control of the seven seas. It was early 1939, and his top naval officer had just presented him with 3 grand plans to build the most powerful fleet on the planet. The first 2, Plan X and Plan Y, didn't convince the Fuhrer. But the last one, Plan Z, was exactly what the Reich had been looking for. On paper, the strategy was groundbreaking. Germany would build roughly 800 warships, giving Nazi sailors a full range of aircraft carriers, battle cruisers, destroyers, armored ships, and torpedo boats. The Navy's manpower would swell past 200,000, producing a new generation of battle-ready seamen, prepared to square off against the worst that foreign navies could throw at them. But by the time World War II broke out later that year, it had become evident that Plan Z was a sham. The situation at the Kriegsmarine was pathetic. Germany hadn't even reached half the personnel it expected. And while the Royal Navy remained the most powerful fleet on Earth, with 20 battleships, 12 carriers, 90 cruisers, and 100 destroyers, and an entire ocean's worth of support vessels, the Germans had 2 battleships, 2 pre-dreadnoughts, 3 pocket battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, 8 light cruisers, and 21 destroyers. By some estimates, it wasn't even 20% of the naval power Plan Z had promised. Hitler understood the problem. If the Kriegsmarine was ever going to get a real fighting chance at sea, Germany would need a completely different approach. Investing in U-boats was one strategy. They were faster to build, harder to track, and perfectly designed to make the Allies think twice about crossing open water. But it still wasn't enough. The Kriegsmarine needed a strike force that wasn't afraid to bend the rules. A crew of men who could hunt like wolves, survive in the roughest seas on Earth, and stay out for months, even years, if that's what it took to drag home their prize. They didn't need a conventional battleship formation. They needed a fleet of Nazi pirates. The fastest way for Hitler to build a team of naval mercenaries was to recruit ships wherever he could find them. It didn't matter if they hadn't been designed to tear open Allied hulls. As long as they could carry a few guns, take a hit, and stay afloat long enough to make it back to port, that was good enough. 5 German cargo ships were identified as prime candidates: Goldenfels, Santa Cruz, Germark, Kandofels, and Neumark. Most of them were fairly new. The oldest was barely 10 years old. They weren't massive capital ships, nothing like the monsters waiting for them out in open water. Each displaced less than 20,000 tons, and most were about 500 feet long. Still, with the right conditioning and the right training, they could become exactly the kind of threat the Kriegsmarine was looking for. Soon, these vessels were being torn apart in shipyards by engineers stripping out anything that didn't belong on a Corsair. Some ships were fitted with expanded fuel tanks that more than doubled their range, turning ordinary merchants into long-distance predators, capable of reaching ports they were never meant to visit, and lingering in empty oceans for months while they stalked Allied shipping lanes. Weaponry, however, was trickier. These ships needed enough punch to sink a target quickly. At the same time, the guns had to vanish on command, because their entire strategy would depend on deception, and if a cruiser appeared on the horizon or a patrol aircraft came sniffing around, those weapons had to be kept out of sight. The Kriegsmarine settled on a standard radar arsenal that only varied slightly between ships, typically 6 150mm guns, a mix of 20mm and 37mm anti-aircraft weapons, torpedo tubes, and space for hundreds of mines. Many of the big guns were mounted behind steel shutters and folding panels, so with the pull of a lever, they could vanish in seconds. On Goldenfels, even the rangefinder was concealed inside a water tank, so no passing ship could glance over and get any suspicious ideas about what she was really carrying. To extend their reach, the raiders were also equipped to operate float planes, usually an Arado AR-196 or a Hinkel HE-114B. Later, a Japanese model, the the Nakajima E-8N would be introduced aboard Kurmark, making it the only German ship to operate a Japanese floatplane. By the end of the renovations, this little group was no longer a harmless pack of merchant ships. They'd been remade into true assassins, a family of armed auxiliary cruisers known within the Kriegsmarine as the Hilfskreuzer. They'd even received new names: Atlantis, Thor, Orion, Penguin, and Vida. However, only the Reich knew their true identity and how hard they could pounce. Now, it was time to send them out to sea so they could strike the Allies right where they least expected it. Atlantis was one of the first of the pirate sisters to be commissioned under the Nazi flag. Her commander, Captain Zursay Bernhard Roga, had handpicked a crew of men who were rough enough to survive months at sea with dwindling supplies, yet sharp enough to seize enemy intelligence and keep the ship one step ahead of the Allies. Among Atlantis' ranks were Oberlieutenant Heinz Lorenz Kosch, a gunnery officer with years of experience and a reputation for making every shot count, Dr. Georg Reil, ready for whatever sickness, burns, or shrapnel the battle might deliver, and Lieutenant Ulrich Mohr, Roga's assistant, a chemistry graduate, polyglot, and the kind of man who could read a captured document faster than most sailors could read a menu. She set sail in early 1940, pushing out into the North Atlantic through freezing winds and rough seas, slipping past ice and fog as she made her way toward the warmer hunting grounds of the South Atlantic. Aside from her gun concealment mechanisms, Atlantis had yet another layer of deception playing in her favor. Her crew constantly repainted the ship, reshaped her silhouette, and raised foreign flags like costume changes in the middle of a play. The goal was to ensure that no ship she crossed could radio home to report that a German raider was patrolling nearby. Among her favorite disguises was the Norwegian freighter Knut Nelson, complete with a pale hull, Norwegian banners, and the ship's name painted on the side, in lettering that looked just official enough to pass at a distance. Another reliable mask was a Soviet vessel named Kim, flying the Hammer and Sickle, and even carrying stern warnings reading, quote, "Keep clear of propellers," in both Russian and English. However, when Atlantis came upon the British freighter Scientist, she was passing as the Japanese cargo ship Kashimaru. The German ship had traded her lighter colors for an entirely black hull, the Japanese flag, and a big white K on a red funnel, the mark of the K-Line company the real ship belonged to. It said the crew even carried kimonos on board, so if anyone looked through binoculars from far enough away, the illusion would hold. The sailors aboard Scientist stayed alert as the supposed Japanese ship drew closer. Japan wasn't officially in the war yet, but for days, Allied ships in the area had been warned about a suspicious vessel prowling nearby. They kept a careful distance, but the Japanese ship wouldn't peel away. She just kept closing the distance, faster than a normal cargo ship had any business doing. The British crew could start to make out faces on deck and realize they weren't Japanese, when suddenly, the German flag snapped up the mast, coming alongside a banner that read, quote, "Stop or I fire. Don't use your radio." Scientists slowed down, but just when it seemed the Germans had her, the ship made a fatal gamble. Her engines roared back to life. Her bow swung hard. She bolted in the opposite direction, running flat out, pushing her turbines for dear life. First mistake. Atlantis fired, launching a well-placed salvo into the freighter. Roga had warned them not to touch the radio, but the British crew sprinted for it anyway, reporting back to base that the crew had made enemy contact. That was their second mistake. Atlantis immediately blasted the airwaves with senseless noise and non-stop static, making it impossible for any Allied ships nearby to understand what was happening, as the Germans kept firing under the British freighter and forced her to a dead stop. By the time the Germans boarded Scientist to strip valuables and set demolition charges, there were barely any men left aboard. Most of the crew had already abandoned ship, spilling into lifeboats and pulling away into the open sea. Atlantis had secured her first victory, and she was only getting started. In just 6 months, Atlantis captured or sunk 11 more ships, each ambush following the same sucker punch that had finished Scientist. But despite the German raiders' brutal tactics, in the early years of the war, there were still rules that she and the rest of the pirate ships sailing across the ocean had to adhere to. Every ship was expected to hold off on delivering the finishing blow until documents and supplies had been seized, and the foreign crew on board had either been evacuated or captured. At least, that was the ideal scenario. In reality, interception rarely went down without a fight, and when steel started flying in the chaos of a chase, it wasn't uncommon for a few unlucky sailors to be taken down while trying to save their ship from the Germans' claws. So when, on the morning of November 11th, 1940, Captain Roga was giving chase to the British cargo ship SS Automaton, Roga didn't hesitate to order the firing of a series of shells which landed directly in the superstructure, taking out every man in the radio room. There was no point in continuing to fight and losing more lives to the Germans, and so the British stopped moving before Atlantis had a chance to strike again. Minutes later, the Germans were already on board Automaton, prying open the ship's safe. The contents were almost laughable, only some cash that the German sailors had no use for while out in the middle of the ocean. The boarding crew shrugged it off and prepared to head back to their ship. This may not have been their most bountiful interception, but at least they had captured yet another British vessel. However, before the men left, one sailor noticed something near the wrecked wireless station. It didn't look impressive at first, just a small green bag. However, inside was a message stamped with the words, quote, "Highly confidential, to be destroyed, CNC Far East, to be opened personally." Inside was a prize far more valuable than any cargo, a British report on Allied strength in the Far East, detailing the current condition of air units, naval deployments, coastal defenses, and island garrisons across the region. The document was so explicit that it even revealed how Britain was nowhere near ready to win a war in the Pacific. At the time, Japan was still holding its guns in the region. But if the Empire of the Rising Sun could see this clearly into Britain's position, it might finally decide to step into the war and become Germany's most dangerous ally in the East. Captain Roga knew what he had to do, handing the documents to one of his men, ordering him to sail for Japan aboard the recently captured Norwegian ship Old Jacob. The voyage itself wasn't the sort of heroic journey that merits being written back to command. But when that little green bag reached Japan, it was immediately clear that Atlantis had just secured one of the most valuable intelligence gifts of the entire Raider War. Not long after, Roga himself received a special delivery from Japan as a thank you, the stone-encrusted samurai sword, a ceremonial honor so rare that only two other Germans would receive it, High Nazi commanders Hermann Göring and Erwin Rommel. Not bad for a pirate captain. As Atlantis kept racking up victories, the rest of the Nazi pirate sisters were out there too, spreading across the globe. One week, they were stalking the freezing waters near the Antarctic Circle. Next, they were prowling past tropical islands in the Pacific and Indian Oceans, sniffing out their next victim. And when they found it, each had their own way of bringing it down. At times, their strikes were sneaky and solitary. Orion, for instance, started her hunts less like a warship and more like a bomber. Instead of facing her enemies head-on, she crept close enough to the coasts of Australia and New Zealand to lay down a lethal wall of mines, and slipped away before the Allies could even spot her over the horizon. Crews would sail confidently, believing the enemy was 1,000 miles away. And then, just a few miles off the coast, a detonation from one of Orion's hidden presents split open the ship's hull before the sailors even understood what had happened. Not falling behind was Thor, the pirate sister who had a particular way of silencing enemy ships. Thor's Arado AR-196A1 floatplane patrolled the waters with a careful eye. The moment an enemy ship was spotted, it dove in fast, opening fire with twin 20mm cannons to keep the crew's heads down until Thor arrived to finish the job. As the floatplane swooped lower, terrified crews could see it trailing a cable with hooked claws, making it look like a sinister kite aimed directly at the ship's radio aerial. Men swung their anti-aircraft guns toward it, but it was of little use. The Arado would skim over the mast, snag the aerial, and rip the ship's communication line out in one violent pull. By the time Thor arrived, the victim had no way to call for help. And then there was Penguin. She was the heavyweight. In under a year, she sank or captured 14 Allied freighters and tankers. And then came the night of January 14th, 1941. For days, she'd been listening to the radio chatter of a Norwegian whaling fleet near Antarctica, more than a dozen ships and smaller boats, swapping positions, reporting fuel status, and spelling out their rendezvous plans. As darkness fell, Penguin crept in unseen, masked by a heavy snowfall. She slipped closer and closer, timing her approach perfectly, waiting until the Norwegian ships were moored alongside each other, transferring oil and cargo, and leaving them wide open for an attack. The Germans kept radio silence. Not a single sailor dared to move a muscle. When Penguin finally reached the formation, her floodlights snapped on, blinding the Norwegian crews. The foreign sailors were paralyzed. They didn't even try to reach their guns. That night, Penguin seized 14 additional vessels from Germany, taking almost the entire fleet with little resistance. The Kriegsmarine's pirate squad was delivering on its promise of conquering the oceans in the name of the Reich. The Hilfskreuz's success hadn't gone unnoticed by Allied command. After all, these pirates were sinking more merchant ships than some of Germany's conventional warships ever managed. Soon, orders went out across the oceans. Every man at sea was to keep his eyes open and be prepared to take out Hilfskreuz's ships the second they had the chance. Crews were to remain skeptical of every ship they encountered, because any vessel, no matter what flag it flew, no matter what language it used on the radio, could be one of these masked raiders. And on November 22, 1941, the crew aboard the British heavy cruiser HMS Devonshire was certain they'd found one. Devonshire's supermarine walrus seaplane had spotted something suspicious, a merchant ship sitting beside a surface submarine. Devonshire raced in and fired 2 warning shots. A moment later, a radio message crackled back, some confused voice claiming the ship was the Dutch vessel Polyphemus. But the British weren't buying it, and within minutes, signal officers were cross-checking silhouettes, call signs, and every scrap of intelligence they had at hand to determine the true identity of the mysterious ship ahead. It didn't take long for the command and the sailors on board Devonshire to understand this wasn't Polyphemus, but rather Atlantis, the pirate ship that had humiliated the Allies for nearly 2 years, prowling the oceans under stolen flags, sinking and vanishing before anyone could even see her fleeing from the crime scene. And now she was right here, sitting beside a U-boat as she dumped extra fuel, lightening herself before disappearing one last time as she set course back to Germany. The British wouldn't allow for the German pirate to escape justice so easily, and before her crew could get a chance to get Atlantis running to the horizon, Devonshire charged in at maximum speed, zigzagging hard from side to side, trying to avoid any torpedo that might come snapping up from the U-boat, now sliding back beneath the waves. On board the German ship, Bernhard Roga raised his binoculars and watched the British monster closing in. Devonshire carried 203mm guns, which could reach Atlantis long before Roga's own guns could even begin to bite back. Worse, the cruiser could steam almost twice as fast, so outrunning her wasn't an option. The only hope was that the submarine below them would strike first. But as Devonshire got in position to strike and leveled her guns, no torpedo rose from the deep. Roga understood. The raid was over. When the first British shell slammed into Atlantis, the German captain turned to his crew and gave them the order, quote, "All hands to the lifeboats. Abandon ship." That day marked the end of one of the most extraordinary raiding patrols in naval history. In his final report, Roga wrote, quote, "After successfully carrying out her mission and covering 102,000 miles in 622 days at sea, Atlantis was located and destroyed when on the point of returning home. Our bitterness at the loss of our ship has been intensified by the thought that we had to abandon her without a fight." The days of the Hilfskreuz roaming the seas unpunished were coming to an end. But Germany wasn't done with its pirates just yet. Since unleashing its first round of pirates onto the oceans, Germany had pulled off some of the most notorious raids of the war. Before the British finally caught up with her, Atlantis had captured or sunk over 20 ships. Her sister, Thor, racked up another 22 victories, including the armed merchant cruiser HMS Voltaire, until disaster struck when an explosion from the German tanker Uckermark, moored beside her in Yokohama, wrecked Thor beyond repair. To replace their fallen corsairs and keep the Hilfskreuz fleet alive, the Kriegsmarine unleashed a second generation of pirate raiders. Just like the first wave, these ships had started life as innocent merchant vessels, but after a rushed conversion, some rough weapon mountings, and a few steel shutters hiding their teeth, They became floating assassins designed to hunt Allied trade routes. Although every vessel entered the war at different points, the second wave is commonly listed as Stier, Michel, Coronel, Hansa, Comet, and Cormoran. These last two ships were some of the earliest to be ready, fitted with Arado AR-196 float planes to scout the horizon, heavy naval guns to tear open a target's hull, and torpedo tubes to deliver the final strike. Comet was also given a reinforced bow and modifications that let her cut through ice and slip along the Norwegian coast, disguised as a Soviet vessel, making her way through the Northern Sea route until she reached the Pacific. Waiting for her on the other side was her older sister from the first wave, Orion, the mine layer that had already made Allied sailors patrolling around New Zealand feel nervous, and which was now ready to take her terror campaign even further. Taking lessons from the most successful raiders of the war, Comet and Orion wrapped themselves in disguises. Comet posed as the Japanese merchant Manyo Maru, while Orion played the part of Mayabashi Maru. With their new names painted across their hulls, they prowled the sea lanes near New Zealand, watching the routes Allied ships used until one finally wandered into reach. At times, months could pass with nothing but empty water and false horizons. Food dwindled, fuel dropped, men grew bitter, and the ocean began to feel less like a battlefield and more like a prison. But then, a lookout would spot smoke in the distance, and suddenly, everything made sense again. One of their biggest victims was the British passenger liner Rangitane. She was steaming toward Britain with 14,000 tons of cargo and more than 100 passengers when she ran into what looked like harmless Japanese merchant ships ahead. She didn't get far before they closed in, signaling her to stop and ordering her not to transmit a warning. Rangitane's captain did what he was trained to do, sending the distress call anyway. The Germans responded instantly, jamming the signal and opening fire. Shells smashed into the ship's superstructure, wrecking her communications, damaging her steering, and turning the bridge into chaos. Fire spread. Men ran. The crew tried to destroy anything the pirates might seize: codes, documents, and engine parts, but the damage was already done. Within hours, the raiders were boarding the liner, stripping her supplies, and rounding up every survivor. It was a bountiful raid, but Comet wasn't satisfied. After dumping their prisoners on the tiny island of Imerau, north of Papua New Guinea, Comet and Orion turned back toward the hunt. Over the previous weeks, the pirate duo had torn through the waters around Nauru Island, sinking 5 Allied merchant ships, capturing more than 500 prisoners, and sending over 41,000 tons of shipping to the bottom. Now, however, Comet was done chasing ships. Her next target was the facilities along the coast of Nauru, where the Allies processed phosphate, a key ingredient used for fertilizers, explosives, and propellant production. Destroy this outpost, and the Germans would deliver a critical strike straight at the Allies' ability to feed their people and arm their guns. Operating solo, Comet crept in toward shore, sliding just close enough for her guns to get a clean line of fire. The Hilfskreutzer didn't announce themselves like proper warships. They appeared when and where no one expected, and so by the time the ship drew in the horizon, there were no coast defense or patrol craft waiting for her. It was just before dawn, and personnel on the shore received a warning through the radios from the approaching ship. A voice spoke calmly, declaring that guns would open fire within the hour, and anyone who wanted to live had better leave at once. No reinforcements could reach the island in time, and so all workers could do was follow the Germans' instructions, abandoning machinery, buildings, and stockpiles before the raiders made their first move. The shelling began, just as the Germans had announced, sending oil tanks erupting, loading cranes shattered, and buildings burning as shell after shell slammed into the facilities. For nearly an hour, the coast shook beneath the impact, and the men nearby could do no more than watch the damage being done and pray that the next strike wouldn't land on them. By the time news of the attack reached Australia and reinforcements scrambled toward Nauru, the pirate ship had already vanished. The Allies couldn't just sit back and let this new generation of German raiders keep roaming the seas. But for months, Comet kept slipping through their fingers, gliding past enemy patrols while posing as a friendly minesweeper. She even started to get cocky. She pushed right back toward the Atlantic, transiting the coastline of Nazi-occupied France just south of Britain, convinced the Royal Navy would never know who she really was. And to a certain extent, she was right. The British knew a raider was out there. They just couldn't confirm her identity, nor pin down her exact route. But not even the mightiest corsair could go on unchallenged forever. By the night of October 13th, 1942, Comet was off the Bal de la Seine, creeping through the English Channel with a pack of German torpedo boats wrapped around her like bodyguards. The night was just dark enough for her to be able to slip just a little bit closer to Britain's coast, maybe even claim yet another ship before dawn, or strike the coast and disappear as she had in the Pacific. But before Comet could decide what her next move would be, a streak of light ripped across the sky like a falling star arcing above her, casting an eerie glow that revealed her position to any prowling vessels in the area. She was marked. The Germans couldn't even tell where the star shells had come from, but they fired into the dark anyway. Friendly shells slammed into each other, flames climbed across decks, and some of the German escorts broke toward the coast, desperate to hide under the protection of shore batteries. Comet herself tried to run, swinging her guns toward the Allied destroyers and boats closing in behind her, and opened fire, hoping to shake them loose. But the problem with the Hilfskreuzer was that no matter how sharp their disguises were, or how agile they were at carrying surprise raids, they were still merchant ships with a few extra guns bolted on. And when Allied formations came hunting, they couldn't outgun them. A British motor torpedo boat, fast, low, and practically invisible, slipped in close. 2 went into the water, and the little attacker crash-started her engines, throwing up a curtain of smoke that made it nearly impossible for Comet to return fire. Seconds later, both torpedoes hit. The explosion that followed was so violent it lifted the stern of the British boat out of the water like a toy. The German raider disintegrated and sank with no survivors left. And Comet wouldn't be the last to experience the full extent of the Allied wrath. The rest of the Hilfskreuzer fleet would meet similar ends throughout the war. Some were destroyed by Allied warships. Some were scuttled by their own crews after taking heavy damage. Some were erased by air raids. Others were captured, and Germany collapsed after years of Kriegsmarine campaigns and failed to win the oceans. In the end, Hitler's pirate fleet delivered some of the most infamous raids of the war, becoming the stuff of nightmares for many Allied sailors, yet failing to crack the Allied war effort like the Nazis hoped they would.